Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. So today we're starting a new series for the next 4 weeks about how to be a Christian in the age of the internet. And I thought it'd be fitting to start out talking about the Luddites. It's a term not of endearment thrown around to accuse someone of being resistant to technological advances. The term comes from the Luddite movement inspired by Ned Ludd, who may or may not, depending on what you read, have been an early 19th century Brit who worked as a weaver. And in that day and age, there were these textile machines that were threatening the employment of skilled textile weavers. And so Ned Ludd is said to have smashed one of the machines in a rage, inspiring this entire movement of textile workers who were protesting the installation of these new textile machines. But he's not the first person to have wondered if technological advancements were really a great thing for everyone. In the days of the prophet Jeremiah, they were leaning into this new form of the scroll. Jeremiah was dictating a message on a scroll that was a rebuke to the king. And as the message was read aloud to the king responded by having the scroll cut up and fed into the fire. So perhaps the first usage of the dislike button. So the world, right, is constantly changing. People are always pushing back against those changes, often for good reasons. Some go racing forward into the brave new world, while others see dangers in the advancements. Right? Both are, in some ways, correct responses, because with every technological breakthrough, there are all of these tremendous benefits that accrue to society. But there's often also tremendous cost, but they're usually mismatched in timing. And a lot of times, by the time we're really recognizing the dangers, we're well down the road, sometimes too far down the road to put the genie back in the bottle. Thomas Midgley Jr. led the work of General Motors that developed CFCs, which worked as this fantastic refrigerant until later on we discovered they were putting holes in the ozone layer. And curiously, Midgley also played a role in developing leaded gasoline, demonstrating this uncanny knack for finding products that have these great short-term gains for society. But the long-term costs weren't realized for some time and in many ways greatly outweighed some of those benefits. And it's amazing when we think about the advances we've seen here recently, and to think about what society was like 20 years ago. The first iPhone was released June 2007, so it's been less than 20 years. Facebook also launched in 2004. Wasn't until 2006 when any adult over 13 could join. Also less than 20 years. Gmail was available to anyone in 2007. You can hear from your own Nigerian prince. Twitter was launched in 2006. The first tweet was this incredibly innocuous tweet by Jack Dorsey about setting up Twitter. Second was probably about a conspiracy theory, right? And the big question we're trying to tackle is, how do we be Christians in this internet age that in so many ways is less than 20 years old? My generation was the last to grow up without the internet. I grew up with all the volumes of the encyclopedia down in the basement that I would go page through when I wanted to do research. I had to actually go to the library. I didn't have any cat videos. If I had tried to click on one, it probably would still be downloading at the speeds we had when we first got the internet in our house. I grew up and without worrying about things on the other side of the planet that often never affect my life. I actually remembered phone numbers. I did my homework on pieces of paper. All of these things are so different, and I can't go back. We can't go back. So how do we act now? We're called to be salt and light, and salt and light have to interact with food and with the darkness. They have to interact, and so we have to interact with this world, whether we like it or not. We have to interact with it and to go forward. And we have something to say. For 2,000 years, what I love about the gospel is it adapts and it brings good news to every day and age. And that's how it's stayed relevant for 2,000 years. And so it's relevant now. And so the question is, what do we have to say to a world that's somehow both more connected than ever and yet as isolated as any group of people ever have been. So today we're going to talk about connections and our lack thereof. And so to prepare, I was looking through the most recent quarterly earnings of the Meta company, which is the parent of Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. You know what their daily active user count is? 3.1 billion people. The monthly active user count increases to 3.9 billion people. It's like half of the world. Facebook has over 2 billion active users, with 200 million of those here in the U.S. So massive reach, and most of it's outside of the U.S. And in case you're curious, as an American, your value to Facebook per user is $54. They have their quarterly earnings are really interesting. So half the world, right, is on one of Meta's platforms. And this didn't exist 20 years ago. And simply by logging onto a website in the computer that you carry in your pocket, you can communicate with people on the other side of the planet. Astonishing development. We can make personal connections, and yet somehow the internet is incredibly impersonal. And a lot of that's due to the anonymity that's allowed through that. And we're still developing how to use this. Think about how long we evolved to speak in person. The development of complex language, including syntax and grammar, took place within the last 100 to 200,000 years. But we've had like 1,000 centuries to develop that. The earliest writing was 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So we've had lots of practice in learning how to communicate in these methods. We've learned over the course of millennia how to get our point across, how to exercise compassion, how to recognize the dignity of those we're communicating with. These aren't new, and yet we've had the internet for 30 years. This is all brand new. No one has been doing this for more than a few decades, so it makes sense that there's a lot of bumps in the road. We have this entirely new format of interacting with one another. And it's transforming the way we live, for better and worse. And so with all of these new ways of communicating, we're more lonely than ever. In 1985, 10% of Americans said they had no one with whom to discuss important matters. More than doubled to 25% by 2004, and I'm sure it's shot up since then. As early as 1998, researchers at Carnegie Mellon University were showing increased internet usage led to increased loneliness. And so what do we do with that? How do we as a church respond to this? And there's two ways, there's more than two ways, but there's sort of two categories. Do we use social media to passively consume details of the lives of others, or do we use it to actively build connections and relationships that translate to real interaction at a deeper level? I think one thing I think about is how many times have you had or maybe witnessed people arguing online and genuinely had your mind changed? It doesn't happen very often. Or have you had your opinion of someone raised by watching them argue online with somebody else? I doubt it. We usually don't think more of after seeing those interactions. I'll sometimes read the comment section under articles, and when I see some of the ways that people attack one another, I don't exactly get encouraged by it. It doesn't paint a good picture when I see people tearing into one another online. The words we use online have real impacts on ourselves and on others and on the community, even when, or maybe especially when, they are veiled with anonymity. And this is what James is talking about in the letter that we read today in James 3. He's talking about how the bit in a horse's bridle can control a horse that's much larger than the bit, but it's small, and yet it has a huge influence. Or a rudder on a ship. Think about the size of a rudder compared to the entire ship, and yet it's that rudder that steers the ship. The tiniest movements in that can alter a course dramatically. And this is the influence that our words can have on ourselves, on others, on society at large. How do you want people to think of you? And how do you want people to think of the faith that you represent when you go online? If we speak well of one another, if we engage with humility and grace, we build up the reputation of our faith. If we use our tongues to start fires, as James says, the whole forest burns. Paul addresses this as well. He says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of our mouths, but only speak that which builds up. Any bitterness or wrath or anger or clamor or slander is to be put away, along with any malice." How many of you have ever experienced malice when you've read something online? We've all done it. We've all been there. How many of you read something online that makes you angry, and your first response is, I want to respond with tenderheartedness, to forgive one another? We don't do this. It's not our gut reaction. And that's what sin has done. Sin has corrupted us. So we react with defensiveness. We react with anger. We react with malice. We want to correct. We want to attack, but that's not the gospel way. When I think of the church, and all of us as members of it, each of us is crafted in the image of God, which means that when we go into the world, be it the physical world or the online world, we go as image bearers, carrying the image of Christ in every interaction. And it's so important to remember that when we go online. Because when we're face to face and we see the reaction and the impact of our words, it's easier to grasp the nuance of a conversation and think about the responsibility we have to one another. But online, at a distance, maybe in an anonymous setting, it's easier to set aside that idea of being an image bearer, to deal casually with someone else, to bring anger and malice into the conversation. But we have to remember what we stand for and who we represent. Because the gospel shows us that even when we were enemies of God, Jesus' response was to reach out in grace, to make a path for a relationship to be restored and repaired. When we were enemies, way off base, trotting over what God gave us, Jesus didn't respond with snarky comments. He gave up his life. When people were actively opposing him, attacking him, he responded with grace and humility. And that's the image we're to carry into the world and into the online community, of someone who gave up his life for people who were attacking him, who were enemies of him. And so may Paul's words in Ephesians guide us in our interactions online. May our default setting when we enter the online world be that we are people actively remembering that Christ has forgiven us. And may we look for opportunities to forgive one another. May we engage with wisdom and humility and grace, looking for ways to build one another up, looking for ways to build relationships, maybe that transcend the online world, where we become known as a people who interact with love and who invite into deeper relationships to help cure that loneliness that is plaguing society. No matter where Jesus was going, he was so often interrupted. So much of the gospel is all about Jesus being interrupted. But when he stopped and he listened and he built relationships, he built bridges, he built paths. And I think in online, right, we're going past each other. We're announcing so often. Are we really listening? Setting aside our agenda to let our humility lead us into deeper interactions where we can help cure some of that loneliness that plagues us, so that we don't have peripheral relationships that exist only on the surface. But when we go from pressing the like button to making a call to meeting in person, to be like Jesus was and to build bridges, to look for opportunities to use our words online, to build real relationships, to make deep connections. And the church may be the nexus of those, bringing us together so that people have others with whom to discuss the real world problems that we have. Jesus built a community, sent people out in pairs into the world, and that organization, that approach has been standing for thousands of years, will stand for thousands of years more. So may we invite others to come, to find companionship, to find compassion, to find we are so often lacking in the digital world to build deep, transcendent relationships. And may we as Christians, may that be our outreach into the online world, to bring humility and grace and deep connection.